this is the back of the engine, but if you come here, it's louder. So good morning everyone. It's Sunday, the hot Sunday, and I'm in the workshop and I'm working on my car. And when I say I'm working on my car, I'm taking the engine out. And when I say I'm taking the engine out, I'm taking the engine out because I need to do some repairs on it. And when I say I need to do some repairs on it, I need to possibly change, well I know I need to change like some big end bearings, main bearings and some rods. Now let me explain, because everyone who watches our videos is probably going to be thinking, haha, you turned it up too much 2 weeks ago and blew your gearbox, and that would be why it is. No. So when I first did the build on this, like 3 years ago, and before the engine bay was painted, in order to make it look the way that it does today, I was doing like, it was in the car and I was shaking down everything and making sure everything that I'd built was on. I had to change a few things, but there's one thing that I did with the oil system which broke and done a catastrophic problem on it. Was basically, anyone watching these videos and knows the South Downs, there's a way up to the Downs from Eastbourne via Old Town, and I was going up that hill and then I'd put my foot down, so I was probably at sort of like 5,000 or 6,000 RPM, climbing up to the top, and just before I got to the peak I noticed that there was like a lull on power, only to look down and my oil pressure gauge was like on 0, and I was like, you know, and shut the engine off, coasted, and I was just like, in my mind. And what had happened was there was an oil fitting that I'd put on the car. It was an AN4 line, and I'd done it in a way which it just had too much weight on it, and it had been in the car for quite a while, but with vibration and metal fatigue it had snapped. So I had dumped all the oil out of this engine while at high RPMs, high load. And the reason why I noticed the lull in power is because the bearing in the turbo had worn and the turbo had basically started to stop spinning, and that's when it drew my attention. So it knackered the turbo. I got it back to my house. I put some oil in it. When I started it up, it was like knocking badly, but then it stopped knocking. In the preceding days after that, I did, and I think in that week I did like 4 oil changes, new filters, new oil. And I just wanted to see whether or not I was gonna, not if I had got away with it completely, or whether it was something I was gonna have to address there and then, or whether it was something that maybe could surface later on down the line. And it didn't knock, and it was noisier. The engine was generally a little bit noisier, so I'd taken the cams out and I checked the lobes, and checked the distances between the cups and the cams, and they were all good. There was no score in there, so I pretty much knew that the top of the engine was okay. So it was after chatting to Dan at Boffy Racing. He recommended I maybe switch to a 1050 weight oil, because my engine had self-machined itself to race spec clearances on the bearings, I think, and it's been okay for the past probably 3 years. You know, I went to Germany in it last year and it's been okay, but the car always had a little sound from when you started it up, and I always sort of maybe put it down to piston slap, and it disappeared. But over the past 2 months, this little sound has been getting just a smidgen louder, and it was already at this point when I did my gearbox 2 weeks ago. But then I was concentrating on getting the gearbox done, and I hadn't already ascertained to what this noise was. So when I put the gearbox back in and I drove it, I started delving into sort of like what this noise could be, and the noise definitely sounds like it's coming from underneath, probably near maybe piston 1 or piston 2, rod bearing, main bearing maybe. So the damage that I think I had done caused to this engine some years ago, I think has now just decided to surface. So I also did an oil change on this because it was due its oil change, and I cleaned the bucket out that we put it in very meticulously. I've got a magnetic sump plug on it, and I would say that the debris on the sump plug was very minimal, very minimal, and there was no glitter or metal in the oil either. So I think, I mean, I do run a HKS oil filter on this, and that goes down to a lower micron filtration, so the chances are maybe that if there was anything very small in the oil, it's probably in the old oil filter. But whatever damage I did 2 or 3 years ago, it obviously, my bearing clearances or clearances within the engine were made bigger, which the oil was able to facilitate the thicker oil over a period of time. But I wasn't at the time prepared to strip the engine down when it was sort of running, and it has run for like 3 years. But now I think with obviously a larger clearance in the bearings over a period of time, that will make things bigger, which is what's happened. So I'm going to, so before I take it out, we'll start it up. And so you can sort of hear there's a little tappy sound, tappy / knock right there when you lift off on the overrun. There you go. That noise you can hear then is the head at the top end. That's always been there from the engine build. It's got uprated springs, so that's a bit noisier, but if I lift off, there it is. There it is now. Just tapping away. Now I am no engine builder. I'm no expert in engine building. And anyone who's watched my videos, I built this engine. It's the only engine I've built a couple, but this is the first engine that I've built from being machined and built up from scratch, gapped the rings myself and everything. And I'm pleased with how it's sort of coped with that abuse that I have given it over the past 3 years. But that noise you can hear in the background, it was a lot quieter, and it stayed that level of quietness for years. But we go up, you'll be able to hear how noisy it sort of is underneath the car. This is the back of the engine, but if you come here, it's louder. But then you haven't got the oil pan baffling it, so it sounds like it's coming from there, but it could be further down. It could be just being baffled by the fact that the oil pan comes lower, and that's going to be full of oil. So I don't really know. All I know is that it's Sunday. I shouldn't be here, although I want to be here because I want to get this out. I have bought new parts from the Boffy shop. So what I've done is I suspect it's probably just either a rod bearing or a main bearing, and I'm hoping I haven't actually damaged the crank. But there's a very high chance that when I take this out, the crank's going to be scored, and so on. So I've got a couple of options in the way forward which I'm going to go, and we'll just see what happens when I get it out. So the next video, I'm not going to film me getting it out. The next video will be of me with the engine out and then maybe taking it apart. So Sunday, the weather's hot. See you in a minute. So welcome along, guys. I'm now at home and I've taken the engine apart. So literally, if you've been watching this video continuation, I think about a minute ago, I sort of pointed at the car and thought it's coming from the front of the engine, and I was right. So what I've done so far is, oh come on. So engine's all apart, cylinder 1, 2, 3, 4. Cranks out, so that's main bearing cap 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I've got it laid out over here. Pistons, big end bearings, thrust washer, main bearings, my crank. So the culprit ended up being number 1 bearing cap. You can see it's all shot to bits. I'm sure there's other damage. I mean, I have measured these other bearings, and the bearings 2, 3, 4 and 5, they all measure the same thickness. However, there is some wear on the crank, which I don't know whether or not is something that was possibly previous or not. I don't know, but I mean, that's definitely going to wear. I would have thought the material of the bearing would be softer than the crank to cause that damage, but there is some grooves on there which I can feel. So that's good. I was pleased about that, really, because I wanted to take this engine apart and find a problem. And not have bearings in a tolerance which was like, so what was the cause of that problem? I wanted to find something which I could say, yep, that was the problem. So again, this is a result of my engine was high RPMs, it ran dry on oil. At the time, I went two ways with it. I could have either just stripped it down and see what the damage was, or I did some oil changes and see what would happen, basically. And it didn't knock, it ran good, and it ran good for years. But I always thought that this moment would come, which is why I had a spare crank and some other bits put by in the workshop, so I could sort of, like, if something did happen, I'll take it apart and I'll just address it then. So that's what I've done. So interestingly enough, I've measured the crank from it's a used crank, but the crank from mine, and there is a slight difference in it. So the crank that I'm going to be putting in the car measures for a diameter of 50 mil and that's with my gauge. So I won't use that because I can't see it. So anyway, that is 50 mil, but the diameter of the same bearing of the crank, where the bearing was on my old crank, is, I think it was 49.75 mil. So it lost 0.25 of a mil, which, you know, in the scheme of things is a lot. So if it's lost that on the crank and then also the bearing's worn, then that's going to be the result of knocking. So my plan forward on this now is so I've checked over everything else as well. So I've measured my rods, they're all in good condition, the small ends are in good condition. But I am going to be changing my Max Speedy rods for some Manly rods. Pistons are in good shape as well. I'm sorry about the lighting, guys, but they're all good. There's no signs of any sort of pre-detonation on them at all. They've just got some carbon build-ups on them. You can see the edges are like really good. So no need to show the rest of them, they're all the same. So yeah, that's the little table that I've got going on at the moment. So I'm now going to take the pistons apart. I've got new rings, I've got new rods, new bearings, I've got a crank. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the clutch, flywheel, and I've got an ATI damper as well. Now, the ATI damper I've got is one of the early ones, which are really tight on the crank. They're ridiculously tight. So I'm going to get the machine shop to like just shave a really small amount off the inside, like minimal, Still to be a tight fit, but the fit at the moment is just ridiculous. I just about got it off with a pulley. And I remember when I put it on, it was just, I thought the bolt was going to snap. The torque that I had to put on it was just silly. So I know it has been done, and there's other guys that are doing it with those dampers. So I'm going to get that machine so it goes on the crank a slightly bit easier, still a tight fit, and then I'm going to get all the rotating assembly balanced. And then hopefully get this engine put back together, because the engine itself, the bores are all in good order as well. There was no scoring on them. Can't really see, but let me flip it around. Hang on, bear with me. Right. Okay, so I can still see the honing marks. Those marks are just where the piston rubs on the wall. That's the passenger side. That's the worst side because of the rotation of the engine. But there's no grooves and it all looks good in there. Very minimal wear, I would say. I'm not an expert engine builder, but I've got some gauges to sort of put in there, and I think that's going to be fine. Car didn't smoke at all. So my reasoning or opinion on the reasons why number one bearing went. So I was speaking to John, who's going to be doing the work for me, and who's an engine builder, and he was saying that obviously in engine oil starvation, the main bearings are the first to feel that starvation. And I guess the number one cap is the first one from the pump. So if the pump has stopped pumping or oil is flowing from that, that is the one that's going to get the oil loss first, I would have assumed, because there's still oil within that system. If any engineering person out there has got some philosophies on that, feel free to comment. But in just of a very basic understanding of a pump pumping from one port to feeding down here, if it loses its pump here, there's still going to be residual oil within the system, which will then wear out, but the first one to get it is going to lose its oil first. So that's my own sort of reason why I think number one is the one that has felt this wear the most. So the next thing for me to do, so the next video will be, I think, of assembling, basically. I'm going to be putting this engine back together exactly how I did the first time, the same piston ring gaps, because there's nothing in this engine that's telling me that there was anything wrong other than the unfortunate mishap of starving it of oil, which was very, very annoying when it happened. I felt like maybe I dodged a bullet at the time, but I always had this thing in the back of my mind thinking, something will surface. You can't run an engine with no oil and not have a problem at some point come in. So it machined its tolerances to I think as much as you could probably get away with. Had I have not noticed it and carried on maybe driving for maybe another 10 seconds possibly, I think it would have been engine out time at the time. But yeah, it had only been in the car for a little while. But never mind. I'm gonna build it better in terms of when it was built, the full rotation assembly wasn't balanced. Rods, pistons were, but I'm now getting the whole lot done, so it should rev a little bit smoother at the top end. I did notice a little vibration when it got into the high RPMs. When it went above 7, there was this vibration that came through the pedals, and it didn't do it initially. So I'm guessing that's where the wear possibly on the engine was, and that's it. So I'm hoping this video is presentable. It is in my kitchen, well, my old kitchen at home, soon to be a sort of another bedroom and a small lounge, because we had a bit of some work. Anyway, that's where it is. It's quite handy at the moment because the wife's not shouting at me. Otherwise, if I didn't have this, it would probably be in the kitchen somewhere. But there you go. So I'll see you on the next video, where I should have everything balanced, and I'll probably do a time lapse of maybe of me putting everything back together. See you then.